Dreamworks Animation's most recent film, The Wild Robot, is a heartwarming masterpiece full of stunning visual storytelling, deeply emotional moments, and just pure charm. Many are calling it one of the studio's best films, so we wanted to revisit that topic and see where the movie ranks in our official Dreamworks Animated Movie Tier List.
DreamWorks Animation is known for its ups and downs. Some of its films are absolute creative masterpieces. Others are pretty bad. Let's start with the bottom of the barrel. The F tier is where we're going to find DreamWorks' worst films, whether they be badly written, incredibly frustrating, or just all around bad. Kicking things off, we have Shrek, the third, easily considered the worst sequel that DreamWorks has ever made.
I know how it happened. I just can't believe it.
While it wasn't bad enough to completely kill the Shrek franchise, it certainly did some damage to its reputation. More so than any other Shrek film and many other DreamWorks films, this one seemed primarily focused on pop culture references and gags more than anything else, much to the point of its detriment. It's not particularly funny, and the story is incredibly lackluster given how much of a downgrade Prince Charming is as a solo villain. And speaking of charm, you're not going to find much of that, or much of Shrek's classic heart here. Shrek's anxiety about being a dad feels very by the numbers, and many have pointed out how this only relatable to adults subplot combined with the super childish humor of this third installment makes the whole thing come off as very confused, not really knowing what audience they're trying to target, and thus not really being able to please anyone. Overall, this film is just very messy and painfully unfunny, easily making it one of DreamWorks' worst, possibly the worst. Following it, we have Spirit Untamed, another sequel that really had no business being theatrically released considering its connection to the Netflix cartoon. But hey, DreamWorks treated it like a legitimate part of their filmography, so we're gonna judge it by those same merits.
Here we go.
Starting off, while this movie doesn't do anything to ruin the original Spirit's legacy as it's following Spirit's son instead of the famous horse itself, it still doesn't feel like it's really adding anything to the original story. Everything it tries to do just feels like a pale imitation of the moments and themes from the first film, not being unique nor interesting enough to truly stand on its own. Cookie cutter and painfully generic seem like the perfect ways to describe this film, with even the animation not being able to compare to even modern-day DreamWorks films, much less the original Spirit.
What?
That's not good.
Finally, while Shrek 3 might not have known who its audience was, Spirit Untamed seemed like it's only trying to appeal to young girls who like horses. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it still doesn't try to really be anything extraordinary or amazing, with each of the main characters feeling pretty one-dimensional.
Ride like the wind, Senor Carrots!
It's just boring, predictable, and lacking in personality, unfortunately, and we can't really see anyone, including horse girls, that is, girls that like horses, wanting to watch this movie more than once. Finishing off the F tier, we really couldn't leave this section without talking about Shark Tale. Oh boy, what is there left to say about Shark Tale? This movie is pretty infamous after all, for its poor animation and ugly art, its unlikable characters, and its predictable and incredibly frustrating story. Let's not mince words here, Oscar is a terrible protagonist, and well, that's partially the point.
Oscar, you cute, but you're a nobody.
He doesn't exactly grow nor improve a ton throughout the film, making his eventual happy ending feel, frankly, unearned. The other characters are okay, at best, though the allegories done with Lenny and his whole story haven't exactly aged well. Then there are the gross-out jokes, the abundance of unfunny pop culture references, and just an overall distasteful nature to the film that many can't ignore. But to Shark Tale's credit, at least it wasn't an awful adaptation to an already great film or franchise like the other two films in this tier were. What's more, as bad as Shark Tale is, some people out there have found some ironic enjoyment in it, putting it in that so bad it's good category.
It's not too bad.
Okay, well, maybe good is going a bit too far, as not even the irony and memes can make this film anything better than mediocre. How exactly did this film get an Oscar nomination again? Moving on, we have D tier. While these films are still pretty bad, when compared to the previous tier, these films still have their merits, as few and far between as they may be. First up here, we have DreamWorks' final theatrically released 2D film, Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. It's honestly a shame that it was this film that killed DreamWorks' 2D films, as it has quite a few good elements to it. For one, a film based on the famous adventures of Sinbad is a pretty solid idea, and with the right execution, it could have been an awesome adventure film. There are also some strong characters and dynamics to be found here, namely the character of Eris, who, let's be real here, has some downright spectacular animation and flair to her, as well as the fairly enjoyable, if perhaps a bit cliche, relationship between Sinbad, Proteus, and Marina. However, the film still has a few things holding it back, such as some poorly implemented CG monsters, some hit-or-miss humor, and some undercooked story elements that keep it from reaching its true potential. Still, we can understand why this movie is a guilty pleasure, or a hidden gem for some DreamWorks fans. From adventuring swashbucklers to racing snails, let's talk about Turbo, shall we? You'd think a movie about a snail wanting to go fast and win the Indy 500 would be more interesting. Unfortunately, while some fans may be able to get some charm and endearment out of this movie and its characters, it overall feels like a been there, done that concept that ends up not being as inventive as it could have been. Its predictability is seen as the film's biggest detriment, though some are still able to find some enjoyment in how funny or heartwarming Turbo can occasionally be.
You clearly got the skills to pay the bills. If snails had to pay bills, then.
True, it may not be able to stand up against some of DreamWorks' brightest and strongest films, but for what it is, Turbo at the end of the day comes off as more lacking than outright bad or unwatchable. It's generic, yeah, but there's nothing truly egregious or awful about it. Heck, you may even get a laugh or aww out of it, and that's still something. Though whether or not you want to try to claim it's a rip-off mix of Ratatouille and Cars is another story. Next in this tier is another sequel, that being The Boss Baby: Family Business. We'll be talking about the first Boss Baby later, but for now, we'll just say that the first movie managed to still have some moments of charm and heart amidst all the wackiness and the completely off-the-wall concept. The sequel, meanwhile, ends up pushing things to the extreme by both bringing in a new Boss Baby and by turning the Templeton brothers back into a kid and a baby respectively. Yeah, this film has just gone all in on the absurdity of the franchise, completely foregoing the whole, oh, this could be a story / imaginary aspect of the original film. Speaking of which, it can also be said that this sequel tries just a bit too hard when it comes to doing callbacks to the original Boss Baby, but as unappealing as the extra craziness may be for some people,
how about a standing ovation?
it may just be the thing that other people are looking for. We'll also hand it to Family Business in that it still tries to focus on the family aspect of the franchise, adding a bit of sweetness to all this silliness. You could argue that many other DreamWorks movies do this aspect better, but we'll still give this movie some credit where it's due, even if its overall package will still likely only appeal to young kids. Wrapping up the D's, that doesn't sound right, is the fairly disappointing coming-of-age film that was Ruby Gillman: Teenage Kraken. For as much as this movie may have had a really cool concept, most would say that it just didn't really come together in the end. It's another DreamWorks film that ends up being pretty lacking in the story department, coming off as incredibly predictable and half-baked, especially if you know the genre tropes that the movie's basing itself on. Many were also disappointed in the main villain, Chelsea, wanting her to be much more than just the one-dimensional backstabbing bad guy that she ended up being. The animation and art style also leave something to be desired, though for what it's worth, it's still not as bad as Shark Tale. Additionally, for as generic and predictable as the movie may be, the action and some of the moments between Ruby and her mother can still be pretty enjoyable. It may not be a complete shipwreck, though we certainly understand why some people would rather write their own version of the film. Next up, we have the C-tier DreamWorks films, the ones that land right in the middle in terms of being pretty average and okay when it comes to their stories, jokes, and animation. First up is the sci-fi buddy comedy Home. Being seen as another one of DreamWorks' more kiddie films, it's actually not too bad. For one, a lot of the sci-fi text shown within the film can be pretty cool and is used for some pretty dynamic scenes. The main characters have a nice rapport with each other, while the aliens themselves can actually be pretty funny when they want to be.
Now he is vibrating. Is he going to explode?
Sure, some aspects of the film are still kind of dumb, and sometimes O's voice and style of speaking can get agitating.
Tip cannot come into that out now.
But the movie never gets to that level of being truly aggravating. We've also got to give some praise to the climax, with O choosing to do the right thing and face the Gorg, as it actually manages to be fairly emotional and memorable, allowing the film to further stand out in spite of it primarily being a simple alien road trip movie. At worst, the film just kind of feels familiar and maybe doesn't do anything too daring, but that still doesn't necessarily make it bad. While kids might still get the most enjoyment out of it, that certainly doesn't mean that they're the only ones who could enjoy Home. Getting back to the studio's earlier films, next up is Ants. Ah yes, DreamWorks' first film. Is it an underrated classic that got overshadowed by the films that followed it? Well, not exactly.
Hey, it is crap. Not bad.
While there's certainly some merit here in terms of the animation and the sheer ambition, some feel this movie has a bit of a tone problem to where you aren't quite sure if it's meant to be more for families or for adults due to how mature some of its jokes are.
You know, I was gonna let you become part of my most erotic fantasies.
Not to mention all the violence in the movie. To be fair, there are some people out there who really enjoy its themes related to class struggle and its sense of humor, seeing it as a very sharp sort of film. And in terms of how it compares to other DreamWorks films, we can certainly praise its uniqueness. Others, however, may not find the story, art, nor humor of the film as very appealing, being unable to fully latch onto the film's shifting tone or seeing it as too dark in some aspects. More so than most of DreamWorks' other films, this one seems most reliant on personal tastes. And if you ask us, we'd say it manages to land right in the middle, for better or for worse. Next, we have the original Boss Baby. Love it or hate it, there's no denying that this is one of DreamWorks' biggest current franchises, and in its best moments, it can actually be pretty heartwarming and even a bit funny.
I poop, they wipe, bam! I'm the boss.
Granted, those moments can still be few and far between, but they're still present regardless. The film keeps a nice balance between being wacky and being more grounded depending on what the scene needs, and Tim's imagination spots, as well as the animation shift that happens during them, are seen by many as the highlight of the film. The overall lesson, while perhaps a bit predictable, is also really sweet, so while the potty and baby-related humor may get tiresome after a while, we feel there's enough here to put it right in the middle of DreamWorks' catalog. For what it is, we're sure it could have been a lot more gross or annoying, though let's be real here, this movie still didn't exactly earn its Oscar nom. Just ahead of Boss Baby, we're going to rank The Croods next. While this could have easily just been DreamWorks' take on the Flintstones, this film does manage to feel like its own thing, even if that thing is still a pretty simple film at the end of the day. For what it's worth, we have to give a ton of props to this film's character, creature, and environment designs, as these things combined do a lot to give this somewhat cliche premise its own identity. Additionally, while they may be pretty archetypal, the Croods themselves still manage to be pretty likable. The jokes can range from silly to dumb, with not every joke landing, but the humor overall is never too aggravating, thankfully. At worst, you could say this movie is maybe a bit too simple or a bit too predictable, leading to it mostly feeling like a kids-only flick. Though with a solid enough start and a pretty good climax, we'd say that this family has earned a fairly high spot in our ranking. We've finally arrived at one of DreamWorks' collaborations with Aardman Animation, presenting the literally underground comedy Flushed Away. It's unfortunate to say, but Flushed Away is typically seen as one of Aardman's weaker films. But hey, Aardman is still Aardman, so this final collaboration between them and DreamWorks still turned out pretty good in spite of any behind-the-scenes drama. While it may be easy to miss the classic claymation of their previous collaborations, Flushed Away still brings in some fun action sequences that both kids and adults can enjoy. The characters themselves are also fairly likable, if a bit standard. Roddy and Rita are a pretty classic couple archetype, and the film's villains do their job fairly well, even if they aren't the best that either studio has to offer. There are a few setbacks though, like the humor being just a bit too silly and frantic at times. It's another one of those cases where how much you like the film may just depend on your personal tastes. And for many people, this film manages to fall right into the category of just being okay. And speaking of okay, that's pretty much how you can describe Abominable 2. A film that coincidentally kind of flew under the radar. This suburban fantasy isn't bad per se, but it's another that overall feels half-baked in spite of its good elements. While we may like the incredibly sweet bond between Yi and Everest, it's not necessarily the most memorable. If anything, it perhaps feels a bit too much like other friendships we've seen from the studio, all while lacking that little bit of extra something that makes it truly memorable. If anything, the most memorable parts of the film are the environments and how Everest uses his Yeti powers, as they provide the most impressive spectacle. Though if you want to talk memorable for the wrong reasons, then we have to bring up the film's twist villain, Dr. Zara. Yes! Hey, who says only Disney can have bad twist villains? Yeah, no one really likes nor cares about this lady, with some even considering her addition to be a notable detriment to what could otherwise be seen as a pretty standard kids fantasy film.
Everest, look, make a wish.
It's fun and sweet and certainly pretty, but these things can't quite make up for what the film tends to lack in originality. Moving right along, we have The Croods 2: A New Age, another DreamWorks sequel that some actually see as better than the original. While this franchise hasn't yet managed to reach legendary status, many fans still feel like The Croods was able to produce a surprisingly decent sequel, and we, in case you can't tell, feel the same way. While it may have been easy to just introduce a more modern family, they managed to pull off some fun and clever jokes with it.
Oh, that's just your reflection. It's called a mirror.
Making the Bettermans feel less like just a plot device and more like actually fun characters that we enjoy seeing the Croods interact with. There's some added style and action, not to mention some pretty gorgeous animation in some parts, and the lesson about accepting new ways of life ties in well with the original film. It's not perfect, mind you, as there are still the occasional groaners and eye rolls when it comes to its jokes, and it's still not the deepest story around.
Ugh, this show's for older kids.
Some critics also see it as being too chaotic and wacky at times, but hey, if you're looking for a fun time, these two families may be able to give you exactly what you need. From cavemen to monsters, next up is Monsters vs. Aliens. Some of you may be surprised to see this one so high up, as it's one that many of DreamWorks' more critical fans tend to either pan or overlook, with it kind of being the black sheep of the studio's genre films of the mid-2000s. Still, we think there's more to this film than meets the eye. For one, while its premise may be incredibly goofy and even a bit shallow, the crew behind MVA did a great job making it feel reminiscent of the campy monster and sci-fi B movies that it was both spoofing and paying tribute to, even if some of the jokes they do in the film are admittedly kinda lame. But regardless, the vibes are certainly there, as is the heart when it comes to our monster leads. It's nice seeing them bond and grow a stronger friendship over the film, but without a doubt, this movie's strongest element is the main character herself, Susan, aka Ginormica.
Did you see how strong I was? There probably isn't a jar in this world I can't open.
Though you could argue it's maybe a bit rushed, her arc of growing more confident in herself is still a great one, especially for DreamWorks' first female lead. We'll acknowledge that this movie still isn't perfect, and that, yeah, this genre isn't for everyone, but the fun characters and even more fun action are still enough for us to give this movie the flowers we feel it deserves. Stepping into the Madagascar franchise, this is where we find Penguins of Madagascar. Comedy relief side characters being unable to hold their own when given the spotlight? It's a tale as old as time, and while this movie wasn't a garbage fire or anything like that, the Penguins of Madagascar weren't able to beat the odds. Given that they already had their own TV show out at the time, we can't blame audience members for not wanting to catch an extended Penguins adventure. For what it's worth, the Penguins themselves still work as fun characters who have a great dynamic with each other. Their feats are just as impressive as they were in the first few Madagascar films, allowing viewers to still be surprised by them every once in a while, even if the shtick has gotten just a bit old at this point. But perhaps the biggest detriment to this film are the other characters that the Penguins have to bounce off of. Namely, a group of Arctic spies called the North Wind and the octopus villain Dave.
Dave? Dave!
Dave!
Dave! Ah.
Additionally, with the whole movie being an extended Penguins bit with no real breaks in between, some people found the movie to be more exhausting than exhilarating. Even if the Penguins still are fun and likable here, you can't help but recall the old phrase of simply having too much of a good thing. Wrapping up the C's, we have the original Puss in Boots. Hey look, another action-filled movie about a comedic side character. Insert the 2 nickels line from Phineas and Ferb here.
If I had a nickel for every time I was doomed by a puppet, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice.
Anyway, while it might not be as good as most of the Shrek films, this movie isn't bad by any means. If anything, Puss's story within it, from his tragic past to his eventual heroic triumph, is an incredibly strong one. Had the humor in this movie landed at least a bit better, we could see this being a tier or 2 higher easily. Unfortunately, its humor very much lands in the hit or miss sort of range, with some scenes even dragging a bit because of this. Not exactly what you want from a thrilling action comedy. This is also a case where its villains, Humpty Dumpty and the married crime couple Jack and Jill, also end up being somewhat of a detriment due to them not being as strong as the franchise's other villains. But hey, still not as bad as Prince Charming in Shrek the Third. Perhaps the most frustrating thing about this movie is just how close it gets to being something truly great, only for a scene or a joke to fall flat and ruin the momentum. Still, it did give us Kitty Softpaws, who's a pretty fun character, and it gave us the "I was there all along" meme with Humpty's reveal, so we'd say this movie's worth existing for those things alone. We've now entered the B-tier films, which is where we start seeing the truly good films. The ones that, while they may not be the best, you understand why they have their fans, as they are truly fun and enjoyable despite any lingering flaws. Time to take a trip to suburbia. We're starting the B-tier off with Over the Hedge. This movie might have aged somewhat, feeling very early 2000s with its references, presentation, and sense of humor, but who says that's a bad thing?
It is bold. I like it.
Over the Hedge manages to thrive in simplicity, being incredibly charming for the most part, while still being able to surprise and catch viewers off guard with some of its bigger gags and wackier jokes.
Was that out loud?
That whole sequence with the dog's squeaky toy? Iconic. Really, save for the predictability that comes with being a liar revealed type of story, the movie manages to be incredibly consistent with its laughs, not to mention its more heartwarming moments. Sure, at the end of the day, it may just be a silly talking animal movie, but based on how good it turned out, we feel it doesn't really need to be anything more than that. What movie is more fitting for the B tier than a movie about bees? Time to talk about B-Movie. Let's face it, the entire concept of this movie and the places it manages to go in such a short amount of time are just absolutely insane. And for many people, that's what they love about it. In terms of just being absurd and off the wall, B-Movie is probably one of the best examples of it in just how well it keeps that balance of being absolutely ridiculous while still being grounded enough for you to care somewhat about the characters.
So you'll just work us to death?
We'll sure try.
And the memes? Do we even need to mention all the iconic memes that came from this movie? It really is kind of incredible in hindsight. However, we will acknowledge that this style of humor certainly isn't for everyone. If you're not a fan of wacky comedy, a more loose style of storytelling, or Jerry Seinfeld's stand-up in general, this movie really doesn't have much left to offer you. Still, you have to respect the sheer ambition and willingness to just kind of do whatever. Only DreamWorks could make a movie like this, and again, that's just part of its charm. You like jazz? we've finally hit another one of the Dreamworks 2D films, Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron. Almost the complete opposite of the previous film in this tier, Spirit is an absolutely gorgeous looking movie that knows how to take it slow and really take in the environments of the Old West. While some may see it as a bit on the boring side in some parts, we appreciate that this movie isn't afraid to take its time, which in turn allows the more emotional moments to hit that much harder. There are also a ton of thrills in this film, with the last act having possibly the most exciting action sequences that this studio has ever produced. Really, the only downsides we could mention are that its story can come off as pretty simple, and its humor can be a bit lacking, which would be fine if it didn't still try to make jokes. Additionally, the narration done by Matt Damon can range from feeling unnecessary to just being annoying. Some people have also critiqued this movie's very contemporary and Bryan Adams-filled soundtrack, which we can also somewhat understand. But those minor flaws aside, this film is still pretty strong for the most part. For this next slot, we're going to be talking about the 3 Trolls films, as if you ask us, they all managed to rank about the same in terms of both their positives as well as their weaknesses within each film. You've got the fun characters, the catchy covers, and occasional original songs that are just as enjoyable to listen to.
And a falsetto made of gold. Not that anyone cared.
Some surprisingly really funny jokes, the tons of creativity on display when it comes to the Trolls world and the creatures that live within it, but you've also got some pretty simple jokes, some moments that are maybe a bit too wacky and nonsensical, the fart jokes, and other things that may not be everyone's cup of tea. If you ask us, they aren't nearly as bad as some of its biggest detractors would want to claim, actually having quite a bit of substance underneath all that glitter and managing to be some pretty fun films. That being said, we can't ignore how shallow they tend to be in the storytelling department, though we still appreciate its themes regarding happiness, love, community, and family. You might enjoy these films more or less depending on your sense of humor and your taste in music, but we see it as a pretty solid trilogy. Still, if we have to put them in worst to best order, we'd say that Trolls World Tour probably ranks 3rd, while Band Together and the original Trolls are seen as stronger entries, though again, they're pretty interchangeable at the end of the day. But now it's time to leave the world of Trolls and take a trip to China with the most recent film on this tier list at the time of writing, Kung Fu Panda 4. Perhaps one of the most controversial films in this tier, Kung Fu Panda 4 certainly has its detractors, with it being seen as the weakest of the series. While we can't necessarily disagree with that last statement, we still feel it has enough of its own merit and enough positives to it that we can't hate on it too much. Like the other films in the series, the action is still pretty top-notch. What's more, even after several years, Po hasn't lost his step and is still the likable protagonist he's always been. The lesson this film presents about accepting change is a solid one, and much of its jokes still manage to land. We also appreciate the extra spotlight on Mr. Ping and Li Shan, and while Zhen isn't the deepest character in the franchise, she certainly has her fans thanks to her enjoyable, if a bit cliche, dynamic with Po, and we wouldn't mind seeing what they do with her next. That all being said, the film's villain, the chameleon, and any story elements connected to her are without a doubt the film's weakest points. Add in the film's breakneck pace, as well as just how predictable it can be, and it manages to fall just short of being as awesome as the first 3 films. It's not unwatchable by any means, but these notable flaws prevent us from ranking it any higher. Next up, we've got another incredibly consistent Dreamworks trilogy, that being the Madagascar films.
Welcome to Madagascar.
These films really are classics, with a sense of humor that ranges from clever and witty to just plain wacky. The characters of the films, from the main 4 members of the Madagascar crew to the penguins and the lemurs to the memeable Moto Moto and silly villains like Nana and Captain Dubois, are easily its best aspect. Even when the stories of these films aren't at their strongest, you just can't help but want to watch these guys and the hilarious adventures they go on. There's a lot of heart here as well, not to mention some incredible action and chase sequences that are hard to forget about, such as the dam breaking sequence in the second film, or heck, pretty much any action sequence from the third film. But while each of these films is enjoyable in its own right, it's pretty easy to see that the original had the strongest story, while the sequels, though still having had their own strong emotional moments here and there, were overall more focused on being incredibly wacky comedies, which they succeeded at, to be fair. As such, in terms of ranking, we'd say that Europe's Most Wanted was the so-called worst, followed by Escape to Africa, with the original Madagascar being the best in our opinion. Still, we can't understate that this is a very solid and very consistent set of films. Apologies to all the Jack Frost fans out there, but we're going to be ranking Rise of the Guardians next. Not quite the best of the more dramatic stories that DreamWorks has to offer, but it still manages to rank fairly high up there. Feeling reminiscent of a superhero team-up film but with childhood myths and legends, the presentation of the film and the excellent design and animation found within it managed to capture these vibes pretty well. The theme of belief is a decent one, while the characters, while not the deepest ones around, are still memorable in their own right, with Santa, Easter Bunny, and of course Jack Frost understandably being fan favorites. In terms of flaws, it's Its villain may be a bit lacking to some, not being nearly as threatening as he should be, and its story is a bit on the simple side. Some people may see it as trying to be a bit too serious and epic, in spite of its starring characters and child-friendly concept. It's a film that perhaps deserves more credit. It certainly didn't deserve to be one of DreamWorks' biggest box office bombs, that's for sure. Wrapping up the B's is the time travel family comedy Mr. Peabody and Sherman. Much like other movies in this tier, this movie is just plain old fun, and that's honestly its best quality.
Smell my victory! Smell it!
Well, maybe second best, as many have praised this movie for its focus on family and for having an incredibly sweet father and son relationship at its core. Its sense of humor is also really great, feeling very classic and cartoony for the most part, save for the occasional pop culture or history reference. If there are any notable flaws from the film to talk about, many would point to the inclusion of Penny, who, yeah, is pretty unlikable at the start before becoming a bit of a damsel towards the end. Still, we don't see her as the worst, certainly not bad enough to completely ruin the film. Really, it's the main characters of Peabody and Sherman who bring this film to life, keeping its focus ultimately on the importance of family, adoptive or otherwise, and bringing audiences along for a fun and memorable adventure with a ton of laughs and heart. Nearing the end of our tier list, it's time to talk about the A-tier films, the ones that are almost perfect, but are still truly memorable and incredibly enjoyable in their own right. Starting the A's is what could be considered the most underrated film in the Shrek franchise, that being Shrek 4 Ever After. Perhaps a bit overlooked when it first came out, many have found new appreciation in this film for bringing the franchise back to its roots. You hear the plot synopsis of It's a Wonderful Life, but with Shrek, and you think it's going to be a gimmicky mess. But honestly, it manages to be the exact opposite. Not only is this movie a lot of fun, with some great new elements like alternate character interpretations and a whole army of other ogres for Shrek to interact with.
Feed me, if you dare.
But its emotional moments are arguably some of the strongest in the franchise. Like Shrek telling Fiona how happy he was to get the chance to fall in love with her all over again? How can you not tear up a little at that? And we haven't even mentioned the villain yet, who, by the way, is pretty awesome too. Rumpelstiltskin is a perfect example of a villain who can be funny, cunning, and even a bit threatening all in one. Really, the only thing that keeps this film from possibly being S tier is the somewhat slow and kind of annoying first act, as well as just how much they push Shrek into being a complete jerk. Yes, it's part of his character arc, but some feel him telling Fiona that he wished things could go back to how they were before he rescued her was crossing a line. Outside of these things though, there really is a ton to like in what may or may not still be the last Shrek installment. Fingers crossed for more. From one semi-finale film entry to another, next is Kung Fu Panda 3. For some, the third Kung Fu Panda movie is seen as a step down from the second, being a bit more silly and not as dark, with a villain who isn't as interesting or as much of a personal threat as Lord Shin and Tai Lung were to Po and Shifu, respectively. But in all honesty, we feel like most stories and villains would have had a hard time trying to match, let alone exceed, what was seen in the first two Kung Fu Panda films. So in terms of both being a standalone film and a follow-up, the third film still manages to succeed on both fronts, being a truly good time from beginning to end. It's nice seeing Po continue his journey of identity, and it's equally as enjoyable seeing him bond with his birth father and his fellow pandas before going on to teach them how to defend themselves.
I'm gonna teach Kung Fu.
The action in this movie is just as incredible as it always is in this franchise, as is the animation and overall atmosphere. It may be a bit more on the simple side of things, and it may not be as emotionally resonant for some, but this third film still has plenty of its own positives, enough to solidify it as a worthy member of the franchise's legacy. Following that, we have the animated cult classic, The Road to El Dorado. It's really no surprise that this movie became such a hit with animation fans years after its debut. For many, it's seen as one of DreamWorks' funniest films thanks to its lovable leads Miguel and Tulio, and its willingness to be a bit more mature with its jokes, leaning more on the fun banter between the characters and a more subtle yet quippy type of humor. Yeah. It's also seen as one of DreamWorks' most gorgeous films art-wise, having some downright beautiful backgrounds for both the jungle and the city of El Dorado itself. It's a thrilling adventure movie through and through, with some pretty fun sequences to boot, but its characters and the bonds they form with one another are also incredibly enjoyable. And have we mentioned the soundtrack yet? Because yeah, Elton John definitely brought his A-game with this movie.
If they say that I'm a god, that's what I am.
But while the movie has plenty of humor and thrills, there were some critics who felt it was somewhat lacking when it first came out, namely in the emotional department, being just a bit too cartoony for some. But we have to politely disagree, as while yeah, it might not be the deepest story of friendship around, it's still an incredibly fun one. Speaking of having a fun and charming time hopping back over to the Aardman collaborations, let's talk about Wallace and Gromit, Curse of the Were-Rabbit. To put it simply, if you're already a fan of Wallace and Gromit, you're probably gonna love this film. But even if you've never seen the duo's previous shorts, we'd say that it's pretty likely frankly, you're still gonna have a good time with this one, as it puts the best elements of Wallace and Gromit front and center. Said elements include charming characters, outstanding claymation, and some pretty good jokes that range from cute to hysterical. It doesn't shy away from being silly and a bit absurd, nor does it try to tone down the darker elements, like the film's villain, Victor Quartermain, just straight up trying to kill Wallace by any means necessary. There's also plenty of heart, allowing the genuine love and friendship that Wallace and Gromit have between each other to shine through perfectly. Through all this, it truly does feel like a film that anyone could enjoy at any age. No wonder this duo is a timeless one. In terms of book animations, Dreamworks has some really great ones that manage to capture the spirit of the original source material perfectly, and no film does that better than Captain Underpants, the first epic movie. If you ask any adult who grew up reading the Captain Underpants books what they thought of the movie, chances are you'll hear something along the lines of how it recaptured their childhood. But even if you've never read the books before, this movie manages to stand on its own thanks to its added elements, such as focusing more on the friendship between Harold and George and their willingness to do whatever it takes to protect it, or adding some additional depth to Mr. Krupp, making him more of a sympathetic character instead of just keeping him as a one-dimensional authority figure. The film's sense of humor is also pretty great, knowing how to use its more potty humor-focused jokes well without making them the only types of jokes in the film. You've also got to appreciate the different animation styles used in the film, such as the 2D and even puppets at one point. Still not sold on Captain Underpants, huh? Well, how about the Weird Al song in the credits? If that doesn't sell you on this film,
Captain Underpants, yeah, yeah, yeah.
nothing will. Up next, it's time for an excellent escape with Chicken Run. Yep, our pick for the best DreamWorks Aardman collaboration is their very first one, because sometimes you just get it exactly right on your first try.
We have to work as a team, which means you do everything I tell you.
This film is a thrilling spoof of prison escape movies from beginning to end, featuring some lovable characters who, even after 20 years, are still remembered fondly, not to mention some great jokes and incredible claymation that still holds up.
I don't want to be a pie. I don't like gravy.
Sequences like the pie machine escape, the building of the plane, or the final battle with Mrs. Tweedy are easily some of the best that either studio's produced, and for as fun and silly as this movie can be, the emotions and darker, more poignant elements that can be found behind the story and its flock of characters are what truly push it over the edge into being something extraordinary. You've also got to praise that soundtrack, which just goes hard with every track, kazoos and all. Really, the only negative that most people are able to point to with Chicken Run is that it's another story that relies on the liar revealed trope, but even then, it's hardly the worst example of doing a story like this. Even with that one predictable and sort of played out element, there's still just so much here to love and praise that we had to give it a top spot. Just barely missing out on the top tier, this is unfortunately where we have to rank How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. Another one of Dreamworks' films that you may see a variety of opinions on. Its ranking on many other tier lists out there may vary. For us though, it's a case where its franchise-lasting positives still win out over the iffy choices of this third installment. Pretty much everything you love about the first two Dragons films is still here, allowing it to still feel like a satisfying conclusion to the trilogy. For some people, the bittersweet nature of this finale also adds a lot to it. Others, however, dislike the ending and felt saying goodbye to the dragons, even if temporarily, was ultimately unnecessary. There have been other critiques too, like the film's villain Gristle not being anything to write home about, the occasionally inconsistent tone, or the annoying focus on Hiccup's human crew. Even so, its animation remains stunning, while its themes still manage to hit home with a lot of fans, allowing the How to Train Your Dragon series to remain a fairly consistent one as it ends things off on a pretty high note. Kicking off our top 10 Dreamworks films is the last film within the A tier, The Bad Guys. One of Dreamworks' most well-loved recent hits, The Bad Guys is not only a powerhouse in its own right, but it's also a fun return to Dreamworks' genre films, this time being the studio's take on a heist movie, which it captures pitch perfectly in both style and storytelling.
Don't mind us, just robbing this place.
Using anthropomorphic animal characters, it's able to be incredibly creative with its humor as well as how it portrays its themes. The characters in this film are also really charming and lovable, and in some cases, like with Wolf, Diane, and Snake, multi-layered. You also have to praise the action and especially the car chases in this film, which are just an incredible spectacle that pushes the already highly stylized animation to its limits. All in all, there really isn't much to dislike in this film, save for one or two story elements maybe being a bit rushed, plus the occasional fart joke. Still, it's really no wonder that so many fell in love with this film, seeing it as a return to form for Dreamworks. Finally, we had Dreamworks' S-tier movies, the cream of the crop in terms of stories, humor, and animation, and the ones that are considered legendary by animation fans everywhere. Starting things off in the S tier is the hit sequel How to Train Your Dragon 2. We know, for some Dragons fans out there, this one is their favorite and the one they consider to be the best in the franchise. But while we can't go that far, we can't pretend that it isn't still a spectacle movie that does a great job building on the strengths of the original, allowing it to feel fresh instead of like just a rehash. The emotions that come with the introduction of Valka and the death of Stoic alongside the growing bond between Hiccup and Toothless do their job incredibly well, and the action and flying sequences that the franchise was known for at this point were also just as good as ever. Many have also praised the film for not playing it safe and being willing to be a bit darker than the first, even if there were still some comedy relief bits, mostly from Hiccup's human friends. Which not everyone appreciated. It's also been said that Drago isn't all that interesting of a villain, even if he does provide the film with a decent threat. Overall though, How to Train Your Dragon 2 is a movie that barely ever falters and is easily seen as one of the strongest installments that the studio has ever produced. Similarly, Kung Fu Panda 2 is also seen as one of DreamWorks' best sequels. It's hard to really forget about a film that openly talks about topics like genocide, though thankfully Kung Fu Panda 2 never feels too dark nor dour, even with these more serious and dramatic moments. It's a film that still has plenty of fun parts to it, introducing new characters that have become fan favorites and creating a story that's both poignant and heartwarming for the audience. It's great not only seeing Po continue to grow as a Kung Fu master, but also come to terms with his past, allowing him to move forward alongside his friends and adoptive father. The action and stylization of the film also managed to be top-notch, with Poe's inner peace water droplet demonstration and the sequence where we see him redirect Shen's cannonballs back at him being the film's highlights. Speaking of Shen, some fans consider him to be both the best Kung Fu Panda villain and one of DreamWorks' best villains, period.
I'm so glad you feel that way.
Being a villain that's simultaneously comedic, tragic, and all-around despicable when it comes to his willingness to do horrific acts of evil. Again, it's a film that has perfect balance when it comes to its comedic and dramatic elements, and while it may drag somewhat in its second act, the highs it manages to reach are ones that many haven't yet and likely won't ever forget. But enough about dragons and kung fu, let's talk about superheroes, because here is where we find Megamind. Talk about a film ahead of its time.
Hello?
While a bit of a flop when it first came out, many people these days are turning to Megamind as a great example of both genre commentary and genre subversion that can still stand on its own as an overall enjoyable story. Though perhaps a bit on the nose with some of the characters' monologues, it's still an incredibly fun and clever film that'll make you laugh just as much as it'll make you reflect on the superhero tropes you already know so well. Speaking of the characters, this film probably contains one of the studio's most likable protagonists in Megamind, who's that great blend of egotistical yet sympathetic.
You always know what to say.
As familiar as some elements of this movie may be, it's one that manages to keep audience members on their toes through its clever storytelling, hilarious jokes, and themes that still resonate with many, regardless of whether or not they like the superhero genre in the first place. Just outside of the top 5, we finally arrived at the original Shrek. A true game changer for animation, we couldn't not put the first Shrek in S tier. While it could be argued that there's one better Shrek installment, you have to respect the original for breaking the mold. While its story could be stronger and its humor, while still really good and really memorable, could maybe be a bit less reliant on gross-out humor, it's the characters that truly helped this movie shine. The relationship between Shrek, Donkey, and Fiona feels genuine, with the romance especially being really charming to see play out, and is the true core of the film, making you connect with each of the characters and their arcs. The film also plays on fairy tale tropes well, knowing when to subvert them and when to lean into them, and it's kind of amazing how well the animation still holds up after nearly 3 decades. Shrek is a movie that deserves all the praise it gets, and really is a classic all-star through and through. Moving along, it should be no surprise to see the original How to Train Your Dragon so high up in S tier. It's a classic story about a boy and his dragon, and for as much as it may be fairly simple when it comes to its plot and its characters, the way it presents these elements in such a heartfelt and grandiose way truly makes up for any of the film's shortcomings. The bond between Hiccup and Toothless has become iconic in its own right, as have those amazing flying sequences. Even the more cliche elements, like the romance between Hiccup and Astrid, or the struggles Hiccup has in trying to connect with his father, still fit the story well, and thus are able to be enjoyed despite their familiar elements. In a word, this film almost feels magical in how it all comes together perfectly, taking audiences along for an incredible ride. But now, without further ado, it's time for the moment you've probably been waiting for. It's time to talk about our number 5 DreamWorks movie pick, The Wild Robot. Based on the book series by Peter Brown, this movie tells the story of a robot who finds her home amongst all the beautiful chaos of the forest. Right off the bat, I just have to say that this is undoubtedly the most beautiful DreamWorks movie to date. The Wild Robot has one of the most mesmerizing settings I've ever seen in an animated movie, to the point where everything from sunsets to snowstorms to straight up forest fires are all equally beautiful. The detail is just incredible
too, like the contrast between the world still populated by humans, which looks overly saturated and artificial, to the actual forest, which has a more gentle, subtle color palette. That detail extends beyond the forest to the creatures in it too, from that iconic scene where Roz discovers just how quick a massive cluster of butterflies can hover past her hand, to the adorable opening scene with that cute little otter family. This movie's an absolute spectacle, and it's only elevated further by an equally stellar soundtrack. Man, all that praise, and I haven't even talked about the actual story being told here. Roz is a unit from the Rozum line of robotic assistants, her main motto being that a Rozum always completes its task.
Taking care of him is your task now.
Task acquired.
Think Wall-E and Baymax in a blender, basically. When her shipment is lost on an island teeming with animal life, Roz naturally can't find who ordered her, leaving her to assist the other animals in the forest, who label her as a monster.
Hello.
Instantaneously rejected by most animals, Roz is only given a proper task when she rescues a little goose egg, raising the gosling inside as her own once it hatches, but not without the help of her cunning fox friend Fink, of course.
Swimming's easy. I can teach him the way my mom taught me. Swim!
Most of the story beats here won't surprise you, honestly. Roz doesn't feel stuff at first, but once she starts to raise bright bills, she starts overriding her own programming for the sake of placing her baby's needs first, with the help of a cynical, lovable fox sidekick, of course. But just because the story is fairly simple doesn't take away from how impactful it is. Over the course of the movie, Roz has to grapple with what it means to be wild. She goes from helping others because she's programmed to do so, to helping others because she sincerely, authentically wants to, even injuring her own leg and endangering her life to help Bright Bill learn to fly. Through her discovery of friendship, self-sacrifice, and love, she gains the trust of the animals and unites them together, rescuing all of them from a brutal snowstorm and ensuring that the forest is now a better place after her involvement. It's that unity that leads them to being able to fight off Vantra and her hostile robot servants, making for one of the greatest third-act action sequences in the studio's history, and arguably the most bittersweet ending. Seeing that the creatures have literally no options aside from say bye to Roz or make it onto Smokey the Bear's hit list is honestly one of the most heartbreaking scenes in a Dreamworks movie, and come on, I can't be the only one who teared up a bit when Fink started begging Roz not to leave. But the emotional climax of the animals coming together to rebuild the forest, maintaining their bonds long after Roz has left, and of course finally hearing that long-awaited exchange of I love you between Roz and Bright Bill makes sure that it has a lot more sweetness than it does bitterness. I could honestly go on for ages about just how darn good this movie is, and like The Bad Guys, it's based on a whole book series. That means we've got plenty of sequel potential here, and that's good, because honestly the only negative things I could say about this movie are the things it didn't do. When a movie makes you want more right after you watch it, that's how you know you've got something good on your hands. Especially since if there's any studio that can make a sequel that outshines the original, I'd be willing to say that's Dreamworks. Oh, you don't believe me?
Next up, does someone need a hero? It's time for Shrek 2. Yeah, speaking of iconic, this film really is just a ton of fun from beginning to end. Everything from the story and the jokes to the romance and themes, it all just feels like it's been taken to the next level when compared to the first film. Admittedly, Fiona does get kind of shafted in that she doesn't get to do much in the story, though we appreciate her getting to be the one to make the final choice regarding whether or not she and Shrek will stay human. That line about her wanting to live happily ever after with the ogre she married, just chef's kiss.
Whatever happens, I must not cry.
Additionally, for as much as it expands on the old characters, the film also introduces some great new characters in Puss and Fairy Godmother, plus it has some incredibly fun and memorable action sequences, including probably one of the best climaxes to come out of this studio. There's very little to actually dislike about this film, as it all works incredibly well in how it both expands the Shrek universe and reminds us what we loved about Shrek in the first place. It's just a fun time that we'd be happy to enjoy over and over again. Following it, we have the original Kung Fu Panda. Dreamworks is known for its silly and absurd stories, but who would have guessed that a film about a panda learning Kung Fu would turn out to be so poignant and have such strong themes to it? Both Po and Shifu's respective arcs are done perfectly throughout the film, as they both grow and, in turn, help each other grow. Tai Lung is also an incredibly interesting villain, in addition to serving as the perfect threat for Po to face for his first big fight. While other Kung Fu Panda installments and even other Dreamworks films keep the bar high, there's no denying that this first Kung Fu Panda film has some of the most fantastic action sequences ever animated. Tai Lung's prison escape, his confrontation with Shifu, the bridge scene, and the film's final fight are all done exceptionally well. But above all else, we have to appreciate this film for how it presents its many lessons and themes, all of which being things that both kids and adults can reflect on and learn from.
You are too concerned with what was and what will be.
It may still be a bit silly at times, but that doesn't take away from just how dramatic and all-around awesome this movie can be, and frankly is. In terms of Dreamworks sequels, we can't imagine too many fans would disagree with putting Puss in Boots: The Last Wish at the very top. We're still not sure how DreamWorks managed to pull this one off, but we're certainly grateful for it, as The Last Wish manages to stand out as both an incredible follow-up film that ties wonderfully into its franchise, as well as just a great film in general that someone could easily watch and still appreciate without watching any of the other Shrek films or even the first Puss in Boots film. That right there tells you how good this movie is at both its characterization of its main cast and its storytelling overall. It plays into the classic fairy tale tropes wonderfully while still adding its own bit of unique flair, while its themes of living life to the fullest and appreciating what you have could bring a tear to anyone's eye. Its art and animation, being reminiscent of a painted illustration, is truly a sight to behold, and with a fun trio leading the way and 3 different types of antagonists pushing along the film's conflict, there's something here that pretty much anyone and everyone could enjoy. We feel this movie deserves all the praise in the world for what it managed to accomplish, and we hope the next Shrek film can follow in its footsteps. Or should we say bootsteps? However, the title of overall Best DreamWorks Film has to go to The Prince of Egypt. Seen as one of DreamWorks' masterpieces and one of the greatest animated films of all time, we just have to respect all the ambition that went into making a film like this, not to mention how daring it was to do as one of the studio's earliest films. While there may be some lighthearted and even slightly goofy elements to it, namely in the first third or so, the film doesn't shy away from more dramatic and dark elements of the story, definitely not shying away from the more complex story elements and managing to portray the tragedy of it in an overall respectful manner. Its animation is beautiful and absolutely stunning in some scenes, impeccably capturing both wonder and horror depending on the sequence, and while you may not get as much out of it if you're not religious, there are still plenty of elements within the film that anyone can still appreciate. While it may not be at the top of every DreamWorks fan's list, and that's fine, there's no denying that The Prince of Egypt is truly an S-tier film and how it achieves everything you could ask it to when taking on a story as epic and culturally important as this one.